Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're tearing down and completely rebuilding how we communicate by looking at the true architecture of masterful listening. We're not talking about your standard entry-level active listening tips here. No, this module outlines a highly specific, highly structured curriculum for mastering human interaction at the absolute highest level. If you've ever walked away from a high-stakes conversation feeling like it was just two people taking turns talking at each other, well, this explainer is going to break down exactly how this specific training module aims to fix that.
All right, let's kick things off with a massive paradigm shift: engagement before discussion. Usually, in a professional environment or a deep negotiation, we just treat the discussion as the starting line. We sit down, lay out the facts, and kind of just hope engagement naturally follows. But the authors of this curriculum explicitly state the exact opposite. The absolute non-negotiable necessity here is that engagement must happen before any discussion actually begins. It positions engagement not as some fortunate byproduct of a good chat, but as the mandatory prerequisite. Think about the mechanics for a second. If you try to force the puzzle pieces of a complex discussion together without the connective tissue of authentic engagement, the whole thing fragments. People talk past each other. The information just doesn't land because the receptive channel hasn't even been opened yet.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to follow the exact sequence of the module. First, engagement before discussion. Second, the rule of engagement. Third, the practical session. And finally, moving from monologue to dialogue.
Let's jump right into Section 1, Engagement Before Discussion. The source material actually titles this foundational concept, Getting to Listen. And honestly, I love that phrasing. Getting to listen implies a real journey, right? It implies you aren't automatically there just because you sat down at the table. It makes it crystal clear that true engagement isn't just a polite habit or a nice soft skill to have. It is the required gateway to meaningful discussion. If you haven't engaged, you haven't arrived at listening. The module treats engagement as a fundamental structural requirement. Without it, whatever discussion follows is literally built on quicksand. When we ignore this step, we immediately see the consequences. Misunderstandings multiply, defensive postures go right up, people start preparing their rebuttals while the other person is still speaking, instead of actually absorbing the information. Authentic engagement is the mechanism that disables that combative reflex.
And this breaks down the core journey mapped out in the text perfectly. The module is meticulously engineered to move participants from theoretical learning in Step 1 to active, hands-on application in Step 2, and finally culminating in a radical transformation in Step 3. It's a complete end-to-end roadmap. You don't just absorb the info, you put it to work, and then you change how you operate entirely. That transformation isn't just tweaking your vocabulary either. It's about fundamentally rewiring how your brain processes an interaction, moving away from an egocentric communication model to a fully shared dynamic where the listener and the speaker are functionally synced up.
Moving right along to Section 2, the rule of engagement.
There is a really striking direct quote in the source text. In this module, the participants would learn the rule of engagement. I want you to notice the singular use of the word rule there. It's absolutely crucial. It doesn't say guidelines or suggestions or best practices. It states there is a definitive, singular rule of engagement that acts as the very first step of the learning process. This implies a non-negotiable law of communication that you simply have to understand before moving forward. Having a strict rule completely changes the dynamic, doesn't it? A guideline is something you can easily opt out of if you're tired or stressed, but a rule sets an objective standard. It provides a baseline that is measurable and teachable, which means you can objectively evaluate whether or not someone is successfully engaging rather than just relying on a vague feeling in the room.
All right, Section 3, the practical session.
The text places a massive emphasis on a vital pivot from theory to action. It explicitly states that a practical session is used. Why? To ensure participants are able to actually apply the rule of engagement. That word ensures is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. The designers of this module are not leaving learning up to chance. They've built a dedicated testing ground. While the text doesn't detail every single minute of this session, the implication is incredibly clear. Real application requires supervised interactions, real-time feedback, and probably some intense role-play scenarios. You can't learn to swim by reading a book about water, right? Same logic here. The module asserts you simply cannot master engagement without a practical session to stress test your grasp of the rules in a live conversational environment.
So the crucial takeaway is this intentional two-part mechanism. The module dictates a strict sequence. You have to learn the rule first, but then it absolutely requires a practical session to verify that the application actually happens. One literally cannot exist without the other in this curriculum. Theory without practice is just memorization.
And practice without theory? Well, that's just guessing. Think about what guessing looks like in a high-stakes conversation. You're basically throwing communication tactics at the wall to see what sticks. You might nod your head or mirror body language or repeat phrases back, but without the underlying theory, the core rule of engagement, those are just empty performance metrics. By tightly linking the rule with immediate application, the module essentially guarantees that true engagement becomes an internalized capability.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 4, Monologue to Dialogue. Here is the ultimate promise of the entire curriculum. The text explicitly states, lastly, the participants would learn how to transform from monologue to dialogue in this module. This final phase is a total metamorphosis. Transform is a massive, heavy-hitting word to use. It's not promising to improve your dialogue or tweak your conversation skills. It promises participants they will undergo a complete transformation in how they interact. Honestly, this heavily implies that before this training, our default state of communication is something entirely different and frankly highly ineffective. In that default state, we are functionally isolated, just focusing on our own internal narrative, even while the other person is speaking. The whole goal here is a complete structural overhaul of that bad instinct.
And that broken default state, that's the monologue. Crossing the chasm from a disconnected monologue to a masterful, engaged dialogue is the entire successful journey of this training. A monologue is inherently isolated. It's talking at someone. It's exactly what happens when you don't use the rule of engagement. And the emotional and productive toll of that monologue is severe. It breeds frustration, misalignment, and ultimately complete isolation within a team or a relationship. But a dialogue? That is a shared, dynamic exchange. That's where you achieve real synergy and genuine collaboration. By forcing engagement before discussion and rigorously practicing that rule, the module promises to tear down the walls of our individual monologues and build a sustainable bridge of dialogue.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final, pretty provocative thought about your own daily interactions. Based on the strict architecture of this module, we all have to ask ourselves, are you actually engaging, or are you just waiting for your turn in a monologue? In our big meetings, in our personal lives, are we truly establishing engagement first, or are we really just stringing together a series of isolated thoughts, tapping our feet, waiting for our turn to speak? The source material we unpack today strongly suggests that moving past that takes a definitive rule, rigorous practice, and a total fundamental transformation of how we approach listening. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.